register. Amy, you're at 5. Aloha and welcome to the People's Budget Forum, hosted by myself, Representative Belatti, and Hawaii Appleseed, with support from Olelo. We ask that you please close your video and mute your audio as we continue to admit people. We're honored to have Beth Giesting, Director Emeritus of Hawaii Budget and Policy Center, and former Governor David Ige here to explore Hawaii's budget landscape and the fiscal challenges our state faces. So to begin, Beth will guide us through a presentation on the state budget primer and offer some key insights from this primer and enable us to then move into discussion with Governor Ige. So let's turn it over to Beth Giesting.
Thank you very much, Amy, and to everybody. First of all, let me just check. You can see my slides, right? Yes, okay. So I'm just so excited to have the opportunity to talk about the budget with more than 150 people who are participating today. This is so exciting because the budget is by far the most important policy decision that we ever make. It shows very concretely what we value because we assign a dollar value to it. So that's probably the number one fact about the budget. But our budget is also really important to our economy because it makes up a significant portion of the state's GDP. It's the biggest employer. It puts more than $1 billion out into the community through contractual services. So the budget is really a very big deal. The problem is that in order to understand the budget, you have to wade through more than 1,000 pages of appropriation bills and budget worksheets. And so I'm pleased to say that I have done that for you. And so I'm going to share the top line issues that I think everybody should know about our state budget. So first of all, let's see if I can make this advance. Okay, the budget basics. When and who. So we all know that we run on a fiscal year that starts in July and ends in June, but the budget, in fact, is created in a 2-year fiscal biennium. And that is approved in odd years. However, in the even years, the supplemental budget comes in, and so there is often quite a bit of amendment to the budget that year. Who does the budget? Well, it is introduced by the governor for the executive budget, by the chief justice for the judiciary budget, and they are released to the public in December every year. The legislature meets in January and they amend and approve a budget by May. That gets passed off to the departments for implementation, and the departments then make their recommendations to the governor, who incorporates those into the next budget cycle. So it's important to know that the state can only spend money that has been approved by the budget. And there are various vehicles to do that. The main ones are the budget bills. And so the budget bills are, there's usually one budget bill for each branch of government. It includes the operating budget, and it includes capital improvement projects. And in addition to the budget bills, there are always other appropriations bills. So appropriations for usually short-term projects that don't get built into the budget but are immediate needs. And then sometimes there are emergency appropriations bills, and they don't happen every year, but this year we had quite a few, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. Now, where the money goes by branch, as you can see, this vast blue field is the executive budget, and it takes up 98% of all of the spending on the part of the state. So the total appropriations that were approved for fiscal year 24, including emergency appropriations, but these are mostly for 25, was $25 billion. And there is quite a bit of variation on where the money goes inside the executive budget. So as you can see, some departments don't get a whole lot of money. I don't know whether that reflects how we value them. Taxation is kind of small. Hawaiian Homelands, unfortunately, is pretty small too. But down at the bottom, you can see that the biggest appropriations go to the Department of Budget and Finance. And that's really because they manage the spending for state worker benefits for all state departments and branches, also for public worker retirees. And they also manage debt service. When we borrow money for capital improvement projects, we have to pay the interest, and Budget and Finance manages all of that. So there's a reason for that. Where the money goes by capital improvements, I don't know whether, can you see? My version doesn't show all of the markup here, so I don't know whether you can see that or not. But well, darn it, I don't know. Zoom and PowerPoint, they just don't always, they're not so reliable. Anyway, the darker blue, the big portion, that's for transportation. So transportation always gets the most capital improvement money. That goes to our infrastructure for roads and harbors and bridges and airports and all of that. The one next to that, that's next largest, that's for education. And that includes both the Department of Education and the University of Hawaii systems. So since that isn't a very good slide, let's go on to the next one, where the money goes for other appropriations. This year, we are going, well, we approved $1.2 billion for other appropriations, and the vast majority of that is for emergency appropriations that actually were supposed to be spent by the end of June 2024, so just a couple of months ago. And this is how that was divided. So there was a big portion that went to Maui wildfire recovery. The largest amount, though, went for retroactive pay adjustments for pandemic hazard pay for state workers. And then there was $179 million that had accumulated in a special fund for mass transit, and so that got released. I want to talk about obligated funds. Some people call them fixed funds, but I think they're more like obligations, and they aren't fixed because they grow every year. So what goes into those are pension contributions. So basically, we're paying for all of the fringe benefits for active state employees. We're paying for the benefits for retirees. We're paying for debt service all across the state, and we're paying the state's portion of Medicaid. And the important thing to know about these fixed costs, not only are they a big chunk of the budget, but we have to make sure that the budget covers them before we can address any other costs in the budget. So they come off the top. They are the most important. And we'll talk about general funds later on in this presentation, but most of these costs are covered by general funds. They take up about half of our general funds. So I just want to make a note about budgets versus expenditures. We're really talking about the budget here pretty much exclusively, but a budget is a blueprint for how we're going to be spending money, and it establishes a ceiling for how much money we can spend. In fact, usually the state spends 90 to 95% of what it has budgeted. You can see that in 2021, we went over the budget, but that was special circumstances because we got a bunch of federal money during COVID. But usually we spend 90 up to 95% of the budget, and that still is a pretty substantial gap. That leaves about $2 billion unspent usually. So moving on, let's talk about where the money comes from. Every item that is appropriated in the budget is attached to some fund that's going to pay for it. So you can't approve an expense that doesn't have some sort of funding that's going to pay for it. And these are the major ones. The big one is the general fund. Special funds are also a big part of our budget, and special funds are things like University of Hawaii tuition. It goes into a special government fund. It can't be spent on anything except for University of Hawaii expenses, but the university can't spend that money unless the legislature puts it into their appropriation. So there are several other things like medical fees are collected by the Hawaii Health Systems Corporation, and a bunch of funds that go to the Department of Transportation. Then there are also a lot of funds that come in from the federal government, and of course, those are for specific purposes too. They can't be used for just anything that comes up. They are for specific programs. Now, the general fund is absolutely crucial to the budget. It supports more than half of our budget for 2025. And importantly, the state has more control over the revenues that go into the general fund because most of those revenues are taxes and other fees. And so those are established by our state policymakers. So we get to decide how much we're going to charge so that it'll go into the general fund. Unfortunately, during times of economic downturn, when we really need our state budget to be helping the economy, general funds are usually down because when the economy is down, people are not earning as much. They're not spending as much. That means that the taxes are going to be reduced. But the point that I think is most important here is as we're talking about things that we want to spend money on for emerging needs and innovations, the only place we're going to get that money is the general fund. And the general fund is pretty much all spoken for already. So it is paying for 56% of state operating costs for 2025. And for those other appropriations and emergencies, it contributed 76% of the cost. And as I mentioned before, all of those obligated costs that we have to pay before anything else, that takes up half of our general funds. So they get scarcer and scarcer. So where specifically does the general fund come from? They come from our taxes, and it looks like my labels are a little bit off, but you can see that the two largest are the general excise tax and the individual income tax. And between the two of them, they account for 75% of general fund revenues. So the thing to know about the general excise tax, which contributes the most, is it's a regressive tax in that low-income households pay a greater proportion of their sustenance into general excise tax than do higher income households. That's because low-income households, the general excise tax is applied to groceries and pretty much anything you buy and services and rent, and low-income households spend all of their income on those things, whereas higher income households have more money that they can put into investments and savings and other things where the general excise tax is not applied. On the other hand, the individual income tax is a progressive tax in that it is structured so that there's a higher tax rate for people who are richer. So as your income goes up, your tax rate goes up as well. Now, I am going to kind of tee up a discussion about future plans for the budget and show you that the 5-year executive budget growth trends, we've been spending a lot more money every year. So this is adjusted for inflation, and we can see that the executive budget has increased by 12% over this 5-year period, but general funds have increased by even more. So we're spending even more in general funds, and that means that the general fund is covering a larger percent of our budget every year. And the problem with that is that in 2024, the legislature agreed to a big tax cut for individual income taxes. And over the course of the next 5 years, the projection is that it will reduce revenues by $1 billion. So that's a third of all of the income tax revenue that we get right now. And $1 billion coming out of our general fund over 5 years is a pretty important aspect to consider. So challenges ahead. This green line you can see is the actual and projected general fund expenditures. And by 2030, that is expected to be about $15.5 billion. But unfortunately, because of this income tax cut, the projected general fund revenues are going to be pretty flat. And so there is going to be a big gap between what we would be projecting to spend and the money that we'll have to spend on the budget items that we need. And of course, since we have a balanced budget requirement, we can't spend more than we bring in. And because we know that we're already spending half of the general fund on those fixed costs, and that percentage is going to go up, that makes it pretty hard to see how we're going to be able to put together this budget. And it's so important to be able to accommodate the things that will make Hawaii a better place for everybody, the things that will increase equity, and things like universal preschool and climate change and our environment. We've got a lot of things that are really important to all of us, and the state budget is where we do it. So that's pretty much it for me. I know we have a lot of other things to talk about, but I want to tell you there is so much more to the budget. And if you want to learn more than we talked about today, I would encourage you to go to Hawaii Appleseed's website. Here it's listed, www.highappleseed.org/publications. And here's my email if you want to be in touch with me for any kind of follow-up or questions too. So thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Beth. That was a really helpful overview, and also went into, I think, just the right amount of depth. You raised some really important questions. I don't think we'll be able to answer all of those questions today, but I am hoping that Governor Ige, who we are very honored and humbled to have with us today, would be willing to answer some questions. And I think that what we'd like to talk about is really his experience. So Governor Ige not only served as the chair of Ways and Means in the Hawaii State Senate for many years, but also, of course, formulated the executive budget as the governor. So went through the budget construction process with the departments, with the agencies, and then worked with the legislature to get budgets passed. So if you'll indulge us, Governor, we have some questions, and then after our conversation, then we're going to allow the community to ask both yourself and Director Giesting some additional questions that we may not address in our conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Amy, and thanks, Stella, for the invitation. I really do think what you're doing is important. As Beth had mentioned, I've always believed that the budget is the most important bill that gets passed every session. As Beth had noted, it really does drive the priorities of state government in responding to the needs of the community in a very real way. So I certainly appreciate what you guys are doing here this afternoon.
Thank you. So actually that dovetails really nicely with my first question, which I think we'd like to ask you to elucidate your guiding principles. So what guiding principles did you use to ensure that the budget priorities were aligned with community vision during your time in office?
Yeah, certainly, Amy. I think it's always a challenge, but clearly in the process of becoming elected, all of the candidates really talk about the vision that they have for our community and talk about priorities and areas of emphasis. And it really helps to focus on, once you're elected, on how you would shape the budget and what things will become priorities. It really depends on the financial condition of the state. And then state, as Beth had mentioned, our constitution requires that the executive, the governor, is responsible for producing a balanced budget. So, governor needs to present a budget and be able to describe the resources that the executive would have in order to implement those programs, and they have to be equal. So I do think that part of the opportunity and part of the challenge really is the fiscal condition of the state. In my first term as governor, when I became governor, the state was in deficit spending. The cost of state government was 200 million more than the revenues we were generating. And so clearly, we needed to right-size the budget, and obviously, it's hard to cut programs. I think all of you are aware that there are simply more needs and more demands of government than there is resources, and it becomes the balancing act of how you arrive at priorities. But I would say this, and Beth talked about it. The budget does begin with the executive. Typically, working with budget and finance, the governor will identify priorities and things that he believes are critical to be funded, to be moving forward. And that gets transmitted to all the agencies by budget instruction. So budget and finance will probably shortly, if they haven't already done it, provide instructions to all the agencies about things that they should be looking at doing. And that might be in reducing. I know that there's been some discussion about vacancies and what happens with vacancies. They should be talking about, or the budget instructions would talk about priority areas for that would be supported for increased funding, as well as ideas and opportunities for reducing budgets if that's necessary.
I really appreciated that insight into how the governor takes a cue or is listening to the community conversation during the election cycle that immediately precedes the beginning of the biennium cycle for the budget. I mean, it makes so much sense, but that's really important insight. And I think when you talk about these competing interests and demands, I'm wondering, how did you balance these competing demands of state departments and interest groups when you're crafting the budget, especially when they might conflict with priorities that arose maybe in that previous election cycle?
Yeah, so just a couple things, I think, Amy. Part of it is I've really believed in collaboration, and so it is about dialogue with the people that have insight. During my first term, when I was first elected in 2014, housing and homelessness was a huge issue. As you might recall, homelessness was increasing every year for 6 years prior to me being elected, and that homeless encampment in Caucus was growing, and it was really a very scary time on a lot of different fronts. So I reached out and tried to find all the stakeholders that I could find, and started convening a work group on homelessness and on housing, so that I could learn more about it, and there would be an opportunity to identify priorities and then begin to shape the budget. So that work went on. We convened that working group throughout my entire both terms. All 8 years, we had been convening this working group, talking about priorities and those kinds of things. And it didn't get implemented. Obviously, we were looking at right sizing the budget, and we were cutting budgets for the first 2 years. But as the economy improved, then we were in a position, because we knew priorities. The focus was on affordable housing, and looking at the different mechanisms to support affordable housing. It was on homelessness, and as you know, both of you, both certainly Della was. Amy, you might have come in a little bit later in my administration, but looking at different things that we could do to address the houselessness, the Ohana zoning that the legislature passed, the budgets that we adopted, really put a priority on additional funds for affordable housing, and other priorities. So, I do think it's a give and take, Amy. It's about working with the community. It's about listening to the community about the things that should be priorities as we move the budget forward.
And I guess then, and yeah, and I also really appreciated your collaborative approach. I think that analysis or that overview also kind of raises the question of how did you assess your progress, or what specific policies or practices did you implement to ensure that your budget reflected the needs or addressed the needs of underrepresented communities, such as Native Hawaiians, low-income families, or our immigrant populations? Did you have any ways of like tracking and measuring their impact, the budget's impact on economic equity or racial and ethnic equity?
Certainly, I think, Amy, a lot of the benchmarks are really driven by the agencies, the frontline agencies, that are tasked with directly delivering services to our communities. And so a lot of the proposals, as I said, we might say that we're interested in improving health for those less fortunate. And the Department of Human Services would be generating proposals for budget increases in the areas that they believe are most important, and I think most effective at responding to the priority areas. And then, it really is the job of the governor to look at all the needs and make decisions about what gets presented to the legislature as priorities and included in the executive budget. Mm. As you know, the legislature is the only one who can appropriate funds to execute programs. So what is presented by the executive then gets reviewed, and the public have the opportunity for input, and the legislature builds the budget that ultimately gets adopted.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess, so what I hear you saying is that accountability or that oversight, that ability to look at the data is really provided by the departments or the agencies, and they use that as part of their budget requests, which I think is really important for us to consider, like that we are adequately resourcing the departments and agencies to do that kind of data analysis. Um, and I also wonder, because we're so often caught up in short-term thinking, 1 to 5 years out. How did you balance the need for long-term investments in areas like climate resilience? I'm hearing a lot of community conversation around that. Clean energy, affordable housing, you mentioned before, against these short-term pressures like emergency relief or economic recovery.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Amy, it's a couple of things, and let me just kind of give you specific examples, and and there are probably many more that I miss. If we talk about climate action and being able to ensure that all the state government is contributing to reducing greenhouse gases and CO2 emissions, as part of the budget instructions we send out, obviously, we talk about wanting to reduce the greenhouse gases and use of greener technologies. And for example, the Department of Transportation really put together a comprehensive program for looking at the operations of their department and investing in reducing greenhouse gas emissions by more than 50% by the year 2030. So, it's those kinds of things. So the direction is provided by the governor. The agencies are looking at those programs within their agencies and thinking about how they could meet those requirements. And then it gets rolled into the budget. Budget submittal to the legislature, and then ultimately the legislature says yes or no about whether they want to support it or not.
Thank
So
you.
I'm gonna take it over for what I heard from that governor was that really it's prioritizing first by the governor and then by the legislature. And we have all this
Yeah.
constant conversation always.
Yes, absolutely.
So you started, Governor, by saying that when you first started working on the budget, we were in deficit spending. And that's when you were Senate Ways and Means Ways and Means Chair, correct?
That's correct.
So, because you have this scope, both as a legislator and then governor, I mean, you really played like all the roles in this process. During your tenure, what were some of the most difficult decisions you had to make when balancing priorities like education, affordable housing, and healthcare within tight budget constraints? And then what I'd like to add in there, I know you were making some very difficult decisions also about unfunded liabilities, and you did this amazing job of paying down unfunded liabilities. Can you speak to that question?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think it was, I did have an advantage in the sense that I served as Ways and Means Chair for 4 years prior to being elected governor. So I had dealt with the Great Recession of 2008 and the budget cutting that had to happen as part of that. And as you are aware, Bella, that was the same period of time when we got beaten up all the time about unfunded liabilities, the pension, and other post-employment benefits, the health care costs that we had promised our public servants that they would be entitled to. So, it really is starting with baseline values that become very important. I had mentioned that we had implemented that the number one policy would be that we would live within our means. So we had committed at that point in time that we would balance the budget and work toward meeting the needs of the community within the resources that we have. And as you may recall, during that period of time, it was, the budget was cratering, and clearly we felt that tax increases would exacerbate the economy even more. Um, but the second part of that was I had told the agencies that we are looking at making investments to be more efficient, to make sure that our public servants have the tools that they need to be able to do their job. And we were really looking at what are those kinds of tools that we can provide
I think.
so that they can provide better services with less resources. So, I mean, I think those are just two examples of things that can be done that help to shape a budget that begins to reflect the needs of the state and the priorities of the community.
So what I'm hearing again is about priorities, about both streamlining government, but then focusing on those priorities. Were there times when you had to scale back initiatives that supported, in our case, we're very concerned about working families. How did you manage with those trade-offs? Because it's so hard, right? People don't understand. We always have to make priorities. How did you manage that kind of decision-making?
Well, I mean, I do think, and the legislature has a big part of that balancing act, right? I mean, I certainly try to engage stakeholders in building the budgets and try to make decisions on behalf of the community. But then the executive budget goes to the legislature, and you guys have public hearings, and the financial position of the state changes, as you guys are aware. The Council on Revenue revises the forecast every quarter. And there is that opportunity for the public to speak on both the executive budget as prepared by me as governor, as well as the proposals that the legislature makes. And I think it's balancing all of those needs and voices that ultimately leads to the budget that gets passed.
Okay, so again, I'm hearing priorities, engage stakeholders, all that is important, but I'm going to push you a little bit, Governor, if it's okay.
Sure.
Because, we're, with the budget forecast and seeing what Beth had suggested about HB 2404, we're going to be in a critical situation coming up. Are there any specific strategies where you can provide to future policymakers about how we don't pit critical services against each other? How do you prioritize the sectors to protect the most vulnerable communities?
Well, I mean, I think it really starts with the resources that's available, right? I mean, as you both are aware, the Council on Revenues met last week and produced the first revenue forecast that incorporates the actions taken by the legislature this past session for tax cuts across a wide variety of taxes that.
Governor, maybe this might help you out. Sorry, Governor, this might help you out. Can I share my screen with the financial plan that we had before the Council of Revenues came out, but that was after we had passed those bills? I can share that screen.
Sure.
May I ask, Governor, while she's sharing that screen, would you mind going onto your phone? Because I feel like the reception is a little bit warbled, and I know that we had talked about that as a strategy in case the the connection was not great. Is that possible?
Yeah, I'll do that while I'm still talking, so that it's not totally abrupt.
And then wait, as Governor is doing that, am I sharing my screen properly? Can
You
you
are,
see
but
that?
it's super tiny.
Oh, I'm like, it's at 125.
You can make it just plus.
Is that good? Tell me when.
One more. When?
Is that good?
That's great. That's too big. One more. One down. Better. Yes. Good. Hi, Governor.
Hello.
Okay.
I think the question was, and I'll prompt Governor again, we're putting up the financial plan that's after the passage of bills this session, but before the Council of Revenue. And we really were just kind of asking, what are the strategies future policymakers might be able to adopt in light of this financial plan, so that we don't pit services against each other or erode government services? And Governor, you're on mute. Oh, Governor's on mute. Unmute. Amy, could you maybe ask Governor to unmute?
I think that I have asked him to unmute.
Oh, there he is.
Okay. Governor,
Governor, you
Governor, we cannot hear you. It's my fault. I asked you to. Oh, there we go. Okay. Perfect.
So Governor, we were trying to ask strategies to avoid pitting critical services against each other and not eroding government services.
I mean, I do think a big part of that is how the base budget is constructed, right? The instructions to the agencies would have to recognize and ask them. I'm going to shut down my computer since I'm on.
Technology.
Well, yes, well, we're taking care of those issues and we're going to hopefully get Governor back. We are seeing, and we want to thank the over 70 people who joined on in the course of this first hour. We appreciate all of the questions that are being placed in. Oh, there we go. Hi, Governor. And then we're going to be at the 6 o'clock at the top of the hour. I'm going to start opening it up to questions. Amy, after Governor answers this, I'm going to pass the baton back to you.
Yeah, so I do think it really starts with the budget building process with the agencies. And, you know, as part of the instructions, part of that might be if reductions are required, asking the agencies to identify reductions, and really making sure that they also identify the impacts of what those reductions would be. We always ask them for alternatives. Are there ways that if we provided additional funds, we could continue to provide the services at the same time as we are reducing the overall spending of the agency. So I will be very honest with you. When there isn't sufficient revenues, it's tough managing the budget. As you know, so many of the services that we provide are really the state is the provider of last resort. You know, whether we're looking at health insurance for those most in need, you know, food stamps, rental assistance, you know, all of those kinds of programs are programs that the state provides that that if not for the state support, people would go hungry or they would become houseless or fall into a very, very bad situation.
Thank you, Governor. So as was mentioned before in Beth's overview, HB 2404 created a significant budget gap. So from your perspective as a former governor, what are your initial thoughts about how this legislation has impacted the state's finances, and how might your administration have approached a similar fiscal challenge? Because I know that versions of something approximating HB 2404 were also introduced during your tenure. So I'm just wondering, like, what is your approach to this kind of question?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it really is looking at, I would say this, the state constitution really does provide the best balancing of fiscal accountability and responsibility. So, the fact that we have an independent body that is generating the forecasts really ensures that the state doesn't create its own forecast to generate it to justify its expending. So I do think that in the next month or two, as the official Council on Revenues forecast gets finalized and distributed, and then the executive will be looking at updating the financial plan and determining what resources are forecasted to be available and what the current authorized expenditures are, and really how far off we are. I think that, as I said, I thought that just listening to the forecast, it was more robust than I thought it would be, even taking into consideration the tax cuts provided. So I think the next financial plan in the next a couple weeks, we will have a better understanding of how different the revenues forecasted for state government differs from how much it costs to provide all of the safety net services for our community.
So we've talked about prioritization and the processes that you've used during your tenure to prioritize funding for critical sectors like education, healthcare, housing. With the projected loss of revenues from HB 2404, are there lessons that you learned from your time in office that you think could be applied to ensure that these areas remain adequately funded?
Well, I mean, I think it really comes down to priorities and priorities of the community, priorities of the broader state. I always placed a priority on education because I felt that investing in our people through K through 12 and obviously the University of Hawaii was the best thing that we could do, the best investment on a better future. And so, funding for the university, funding for the Department of Education always had priority. So if it comes down to budget reductions, their allocation of reductions were always smaller than anybody else. The flip of that, though, as Beth had said, Department of Education and the University of Hawaii makes up almost 40 or 50% of the general fund dollars. So, if in fact we don't have sufficient revenues to fund state government, they are going to have to share some of the reductions that are required in order to balance the budget.
Okay. I think I'm also wondering, going back to the first part of our discussion, how do you think the budget gap created by HB 2404 will affect long-term projects, these investments in the future, such as like infrastructure or climate initiatives, based on your experience managing similar challenges during your tenure?
Yeah, well, I do think, Amy, and as I said, the next financial plan will be, the first concrete estimate of the resources available and the cost of state government. So, in the next few weeks, we should have a much better idea about if there is a gap or how large that gap is. And that, cutting budgets are hard. So it's probably best to see what the actual impact would be. And so that we have some idea about, if we're talking about a $10 million shortfall, that's very different than a $100 million shortfall. And the strategies would be different depending on what that is. It just depends on how small or big a deficit might be that needs to be made up.
So I know that during your time as governor, collaboration with the federal and the county governments were really important in managing budget shortfalls. How important do you think these partnerships will be in addressing the fiscal impacts of HB 2404?
A lot of the revenue reductions are purely on the state. But as you know, Amy, the state of Hawaii is responsible for so much more than any other state in the country. And so certainly, I've always felt that the collaboration with the counties is really important to maximize the resources that we have. And working with the counties, we can develop better opportunities to really deliver services to the community in the most cost-effective way.
Okay, so I feel like you might be able to dig into that question a little bit more, but maybe that will come up again with the community questions. And my final question for you is really about how to improve our work moving forward. What could we do to improve Hawaii's budget processes to avoid similar gaps while pursuing ambitious policy goals that the community is calling for?
Yeah, I do think that it really is about community engagement and looking at resources available and really the priorities of the community. I know that there are many priorities that remain unfunded and that we try to get started and that are very important to our community. Public childcare, for example, I think is something that I've supported and I think is so important to be able to ensure that all of our children have access to quality childcare. I think is something that will improve our community all across the state. And so I think as we move into this next phase, as we see what the actual revenues that will be available, then we can begin to better understand how we can move forward in the most important areas that we can see.
Okay, and I think again, like we definitely could go into more depth on that particular question, but I guess I would ask just for an elaboration or for ask you to opine, for example, on the situation with the lapsed DOE CIP funds. Is that an area where we can improve our budget processes around CIP? Or is that an area that really requires the department itself to address its internal mechanisms? Because clearly the gap between allocation and expenditure and fulfillment of those project goals is of concern.
Yeah, I do think that the fact that so much of the projects that were funded at the Department of Education ended up being lapsed because there wasn't the resources necessary to move those projects along really is tragic, I think. Amy, you're a teacher, a former teacher, I guess you know. It's hard to appropriate funds for projects and needs of the community. And to have so many of those projects that ended up being lapsed because the department didn't have the staff to move those projects forward is really sad. And so I do think it's a combination of both. Amy, I think it would be helpful to be talking with the department and trying to understand what happened and why it happened, and and work together to come up with strategies that would help move the agency forward and be able to improve the level of services that get provided to the public schools statewide.
Thank you so much, Governor. I really appreciate those thoughtful responses. And I think now we'd like to move to community conversation. Folks have been posting questions in the chat, and we'd like to invite the folks who have posted questions in the order in which they posted those questions to feel free.
Amy,
Yes?
Amy, I'm gonna take this over from you.
Okay.
That's okay. I've already teed some people up. So Chuck Lee, if you could unmute yourself, Chuck Lee, and turn on your video and we're gonna post you. And then Jenny Brown is gonna go next. And then if there's, and then I will call on folks, please use your raise hand function. And when you ask your question, we'll ask you to unmute yourself and turn on your video. So Chuck, you have a very good process question. Go ahead.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you, Representative Bellotti and Representative Peruso, for putting this, and all the others for putting this together, and especially to Governor Iggy for taking the time out of his busy schedule to be with us for sharing his insights. Okay, my question is about the budget worksheets. I heard a lot about budget worksheets, but I really don't understand it. So this is why I'm asking the question. So what are the budget worksheets? When are the budget worksheets available to the members of the legislature first and the general public for review? And the last question is, what happened at the end of the legislative sessions of 2023 and 24 as it relates to the completion of the budget?
The budget worksheets are really products of the budget creation software. So as the Finance and Ways and Means Committee is reviewing the executive request, first of all, and all of the additional spending that is included in the executive budget, that gets entered into the budget building software. And the worksheets are printouts of all of those requests for funding, and the legislature adds other alternatives so that everyone can understand what is being asked and whether it gets funded. So the worksheets get made available by Finance and Ways and Means. When I chaired the committee, I made it available to all of the members in the committee so that they could see the funding requests and what things were funded and what things were not funded. In my last 2 years as Ways and Means, we actually made the worksheets available to the public during the conference period so that people could follow along with the budget and they could see which things were appropriated and which things were not. But really that portion of it is a function of the legislative staff and the committees and making the information available.
Chuck, I'll take part of that question because in the last 2 years when Governor Ige was not governor at the time and we had a new finance chair in the House and then Senator Donovan Dela Cruz on the Ways and Means, one of the things is that yes, while members may have been getting budget worksheets, the public wasn't being provided them necessarily on a basis by both the House and the Senate. So this year, and this is a budget reform process that I think is really important, a budget reform practice that we need to continue is we need to make those budget worksheets available for both the House, when the House passes HD1, for the Senate, when the Senate passes their SD1, and then finally when we come to the CD1. And that's really important because that is public transparency. And Chuck, we can delve more into what happened at the end of 23 and 24, but maybe we could go on to the next question. I think that question was asked. If we have Jenny Brown, if you could raise your hand, turn on your, hello, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jenny. I'm a current UH Manoa student. I transferred in from a community college. So I've been in the UH system for some time, and I'm was involved in student government at a community college, and I'm really active here at the UH system. So it comes from a place of care. So I would like to hear your perspective on what do you see as the biggest budgetary challenges facing public higher education in Hawaii, and what specific strategies should future leaders, especially really voting that in there, within the UH system to prioritize long-term financial sustainability in areas that you may think or your team may think that is being currently overlooked. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I do think that the university does basically a good job with working with the community and identifying priorities and really working toward them. You know, if you look at the university strategic plan, for example, you know, becoming an indigenous serving, the best indigenous serving university system in the country, I think is something that becomes very important. You know, obviously, having programs that do research into Hawaiians and Native Hawaiians throughout the entire system, including the medical school and the law school, are really priorities, because if it's not a priority of the university, then it's not a priority of anybody. So looking for those kinds of priorities that only the University of Hawaii can do, I think is fundamentally important. And I really do believe that the University of Hawaii system, with all of the 10 campuses, including UH Hilo, UH West Oahu, and all of the community colleges, really do a terrific job of being responsible and accountable for programs that support Native Hawaiians and Native Hawaiian research and programs like that. You know, university has taken on the priority of being, you know, carbon neutral and in fact carbon positive by the year 2030, which I think is important for climate change. And they have begun to implement programs across all campuses that really focus on doing that. You know, I've been a big supporter of access to higher education and the connection between the university and the public schools. I think expanding early college to all public high schools so that a student anywhere in the state that wants to accept the challenge of college courses and college credits really should be something that keeps the best and brightest in our public school system. And Hawaii's promise and our commitment to making sure that anyone who wants to go to college can enter the University of Hawaii community colleges and get a grant for their cost of attending as determined by FAFSA, I think is the best way to ensure that anyone who wants to continue with higher education can, and the state wants to encourage that from happening.
Governor and Representative Belatti, I just want to interject. As the current chair of higher education, I want to say that the priorities that we explored this past session included all of the things that the governor was talking about. So I very much appreciate your commitment to public education and higher education in particular. And I would also add that there's a really important need that we need to address around student housing. So it's become clear that we need to publicly invest in student housing so that it's affordable for students to have access to high quality housing where they feel safe. And then the other piece I would say is that we're really starting to have a broader and deeper conversation around basic needs for post-secondary students. So how do we address the precarity of the existence that so many of our students are experiencing? And those, so but I do appreciate so much the governor's comments.
We're going to keep coming back to some of these issues, but I want to give Roberta Mayer a chance. Roberta, you're up, followed by Larry Smith, and then Nicole Wu, and then Thomas Brandt. We'll have you go on. But Roberta, if you're here and you want to ask your question, or I can ask your question for you. And if I don't see her, her question in the chat was, why was a tax cut approved in 2024 if the gap in revenue and spending is projected to be so great in the future? Roberta, I hope I got that right. And actually, that's not a question for Governor Ige, since he wasn't there. It's a question for Representative Caruso and myself. And I guess one of the things that I would respond by saying is that we have been asking for the projected tax losses and what was going to be the fiscal impact. And so this actually could go into Larry Smith's question, who I know that he's teed up. And so one of the things, Governor, is that I don't believe, had not been, because of the way it was scheduled, our last and final days in session, we had sine die on a Friday. We had a recess before that. We had the big day for bills on Wednesday. And then we had budget breaks. I think, okay, well, let me see. It was Monday, Tuesday, we had recesses. Wednesday we had floor session, then we had a break, and then on Thursday, and then on Friday was the final day. We in the House on our side, and I can only speak for the House, typically we would have had our caucus on Monday, but it was canceled and moved to Tuesday. And then we only were briefed on House Bill 2404 on Tuesday. So really the opportunity to understand what were the fiscal impacts of 2404 was not fully, I think, clear and known to us. So one, I don't think we were shown the financial plan, and that typically shows what is the impact of revenue bills. And then we didn't have a time to really dig in. And I know that there were some groups like Hawaii Appleseed who were starting to figure out, oh no, something was not right with House Bill 2404. But because we didn't have a longer time to do a floor amendment, and we had sine die on a Friday, which was also very unusual. In my 18 years, I think 16 of those 18 years of being a legislature, sine die was never on Friday. It was on Thursday, with the understanding, I think if we needed to add an extra day, a recess day, whatever, we could do that potentially, because there's a flexibility in the rules. Governor, so if that's what I think, Roberta, that's some of the reasons why there's this big gap. But Governor, knowing that, what are some of your recommendations maybe to avoid kind of like what happened, where we didn't quite know what was the impact of House Bill 2404?
Yeah, certainly. I do think that the basic understanding of fiscal impact of these measures are really important. And I know that the Department of Tax would have put a priority on trying to determine, once the legislation was finalized, what the projected impact of the measure would be. And that really is important for both the legislature as well as the executive, knowing what the cost or what the reduction in revenues would be is important for everyone involved with having to vote on that measure. And so I'm not certain what the specifics of this measure was. I'm certain the department tried to come up with an estimate and share with the legislature, but it really depends on when the bill was provided to the agency and whether they had sufficient time to make that estimate.
Yeah, I think when we go back and look on the history of House Bill 2404, there was a lot going on in that bill, right, Representative Caruso? So on that note, like, process is going to be very important. There are going to be some budget reforms we might want to look into. But on that, I'd like to pass the question to Larry Smith, because he actually has a process question. Larry, are you on?
Hi, yes, this is Larry. I was calling just because I'm a finance person. And I was wondering, isn't there a fiscal note or a formal analysis for bills as they're being presented to the finance committees of the legislature that looks at the revenue pickup, the tax revenue pickup, and the expenses so that the finance committee members would have an understanding for a specific bill of what the negative or positive impact is of that bill? Secondly, I'm assuming then that would go into the budget worksheets. And I guess another question with that is if a fiscal note is prepared, an analysis of the revenues and expenses, who can see it and who can comment on that particular note? There was legislation that was considered this year where the estimates included in testimony from the state agencies was drastically low. And so I guess the question is, shouldn't the finance committees get a good analysis, a fiscal note for each bill that it would be public and could be discussed, and then that after the discussion it would go into the worksheet? So I'm just trying to understand the process and how we can avoid surprises in the future, and also help the legislators make better decisions if they have really good information. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Larry, for that question. I'll try and be brief. There actually was a law passed creating the Office of Fiscal Analyst that was supposed to be a legislative agency that would generate fiscal notes as you had proposed. That office has never been implemented. And there's no requirement in law that requires a fiscal note to be made available prior to legislature passing. So I do think that that could be something that the representatives kind of take up. I do think that that would be helpful. You know, from the executive side, we always try to, when legislation is proposed, make an estimate of what the fiscal impact would be and provide it to the legislature as soon as we can. You know, sometimes we can be more accurate. Sometimes it's a very, very different proposal that we hadn't considered. But I do think that having fiscal notes would improve the legislative process.
Thank you, Governor.
Nicole, you're up next. So if you want to turn on your video and unmute yourself, going to be followed by Thomas Brandt and then Representative-elect Kim Koko Iwamoto and Annette Tashiro. Go ahead, Nicole. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. Aloha, everyone. Thank you for having this important session, and Governor, for your time. I know it's a real treat to hear from you. I just put in the chat a piece in Civil Beat about fiscal notes, which we were just having a question about. We are the only state in the country that doesn't have an independent office or process to create these notes for the state legislature. So it really is something that I think our legislators could benefit from. My question was actually looking at HB 2404, the big income tax cut that Beth talked about. You might remember her graph showed the two lines between expected revenue and what's going to happen after these tax cuts, that the gap gets bigger and bigger. And that's because it's going to take like 6 years for the full effect of that tax cut to come into place. And my question is about whether or not a typical family gets as big of a tax cut as the richest families in Hawaii. And if it's kind of an unequal tax cut, are legislators thinking about ways to change that in the future before the last steps of the tax cut come into place?
I'd like to address that, and I appreciate the question, Nicole. Let me see if I can share my screen here, because I do have a slide here that addresses what HB 2404 does. And so it does a couple of things, not just cut tax rates. It increases the standard deduction, which as the standard deduction goes up, families have less taxable income, but it also reduces tax rates. And so this example shows for a couple filing their taxes in 2030 when the tax cuts are fully in order. And so you can see the tax rates are decreased for a couple with taxable income of $60,000. They're going to pay $2,114 less than they do currently. For a family whose income is $150,000 in taxable income, they're going to save $3,509. Somebody at 425, that's $8,434 less that they're going to pay in tax. And for a family who is making $900,000 in taxable income, they're going to pay more than $19,000 less in their taxes. So as a percentage, the percentage is more in favor of lower income households, but you can see that higher income households, they're paying a much higher rate. And so this is going to be a real big cut in what they're going to have to pay in taxes. And I would note that Hawaii already has probably more tax brackets than any other state for our income tax rates. And in fact, this bill adds some more rates so that currently a household at $400,000 pays the maximum marginal tax rate. Well, this added several more steps so that you don't pay the top marginal tax rate until you're well beyond that. I can't remember exactly what it was. So all of these things added together, by 2030, the Department of Taxation estimates that the revenue will be reduced by 1.2 billion.
And that reflects the hard impact. I'll take the second question, Nicole. Your second question is really going to what are going to be the options for legislators. And I think that might be for our part 2. So can you hold that question? And we do have some questions from some other members. Mr. Brent, you're up next and you can come off of your video. I just ask that you ask a question, frame your remarks as a question. Mr. Brent, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Brent.
Yeah, I've been posting some miscellaneous comments in the chat, and is my bent. I like to push the envelope. I don't know. I'm just born that way, I guess. But I would like to ask the governor a hypothetical question now that he's out of office and he can say whatever he wants, right? You're free to speak your mind. Let's imagine you were the king of Hawaii and you were a benevolent dictator and you didn't have the burden of checks and balances of a legislative body. I made the comment that I think Hawaii has been in a slow motion meltdown for 40 years, coincidentally with the publication of Land and Power in Hawaii in 1985. I think we've seen poverty, inequality, and homelessness increase. At the same time, the visitor industry keeps setting record highs for the number of visitors and visitor spending. So if you were a benevolent dictator and had unlimited powers, what would you do to stop and reverse this slow motion crisis that we seem to be stuck in now? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brandt. Go ahead, Governor. That's a tough one. That's $1 million question. $10 billion question.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways you could respond to that. But let me just say a couple of things. The Tourism Authority did get the message that it's not about more and more and more. It really is about managing the number of visitors that come here and making sure that we can spread the benefit of the visitor industry across our communities. And so I do think that Airbnbs, vacation rentals has really created the opportunity for unlimited tourism because every residential home potentially became a hotel room. And I do think that the counties now are doing a much better job of managing vacation rentals and really getting that back under control. I mean, we did see as vacation rentals went crazy, that the number of visitors continue to increase. So I do think that it's about understanding what our target of visitors should be and sticking to that. And I really do think it's about trying to learn from other jurisdictions. For example, I think New Zealand does a terrific job of incorporating native organizations and authentic experiences with their visitor industry, so that we can support nonprofits and local businesses. They can work to provide authentic Hawaiian experiences to our visitors. And we can manage that experience to ensure that we continue to offer, and Hawaii continues to be the #1 destination in the world in a way that is more conducive and complementary to our community. You know, the vacation rentals really spurred increase in values, because as a vacation rental, you could make a whole lot more money than you would in owning that property or providing it as a long-term lease opportunity. And so it exacerbated the visitor experience, as well as the lack of affordable housing in our communities.
We're going to keep coming back to your question, Mr. Brent, because I think everybody wants to have the magic wand at some point. But I want to turn now to Representative-elect Kim Coco Iwamoto. You're up next. And before, as she's turning her camera on, I will just say our wonderful partners at Olelo Community Media have told us that we can go a little bit beyond the 6:30. So for those of you who are able to, we're going to hang on till about 6:45, because there are just so many questions. I think we're going to be able to keep the questions going as they have now, and then I think we'll be able to wrap up at 6:45. Representative-elect
Thank
Iwamoto.
you so much. Thank you, Governor Ige. Appreciate your time and your candor. Given your prioritizing education during your time, and you continue to speak in favor of funding education, were you aware of the huge underfunding or shortchanging of impact aid to the Hawaii DOE by the United States Department of Defense? Were you aware of that it's around $300 million a year, and it's been going on for or is this something new to you?
Thanks, Kim. I do know, and my friend and colleague, Mark Takai, really spent a lot of his time when he was in the state legislature looking at impact aid and examining the formulas and making sure that Hawaii would get its fair share. I'm not certain whether things have changed. I do know that Hawaii is unique in the sense that we're the only state where the state provides schools on the basis specifically for the service members and those who are temporarily assigned to Hawaii. And clearly, the cost of those schools and the people involved are not fully reimbursed or refunded. So, I definitely would be interested, Kim, in trying to understand what that gap would be. I know that Mark worked really hard to make sure that that we could get all the funding that we were entitled to. Right. And I'm not aware of what the specific gap is.
Right. Unfortunately, his time was cut short. But I guess my point is that when you were in the position to extend leases, the Department of Defense as a leasee, or leasee, that when you were extending leases, that would have been a great time to leverage that and say, hey, you owe some money. You know, like the Department of Defense owes us some money. And in fact, there's a huge backlog of money for impact aid because we are educating. But did that ever cross your mind, or is that something that we should think about as we move forward?
Well, certainly it's, as you know, all the leases are up. I'm not aware of us extending any specific lease. So that certainly is something that should be taken into consideration as we move forward. As you know, only recently did the Department of Defense begin to be a partner in the cost of the physical facilities, and they have been in catch-up mode, making investments in the schools that are completely within the bases, and providing significant sums to really bring those up to modern standards. And as you are aware and accurate, you know, they did not participate in the past. Those facilities were fully funded by the state. And we are finally getting some capital improvement funds to bring those facilities up to modern standards.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Representative-elect Yamamoto. And that sounds like that's something you certainly can follow up on in the 2025 legislative session. I'm going to ask a question really quickly from someone who wanted to remain anonymous, but this came in through the chat, and it's sort of related to these leases, but a different sort of lease. Governor, the question, and I'll just read it as it was typed in: why does the state continue to charge $1 for leases on DHHL land? And shouldn't we be charging them fair market rent so we can properly fund Hawaiian homes programs and reduce the housing shortage across the state? That's a loaded question, Governor. You can answer it. And I think it really kind of reflects the history and certain values, but you can take a hit at that if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the $1 lease really just refers to the use of the land. As the person may be aware, DHHL beneficiaries do not buy property. They don't buy the land. They get a long-term lease for the use of the land. And the program was designed to essentially provide that land or lease of use of the land at essentially $1 a year. You know, that's something that we've never really considered from the state executive perspective. You know, we have always believed that the land and $1 a year is what should be charged. The beneficiaries are required to fund the improvement, so they have to pay for the house that goes on the property. And then there is a process of survivorship and transfer of the property to their descendants, provided that they have the appropriate blood quantum to continue to stay on. And that's really been a challenge in a lot of different ways.
Oh, Governor, I think I need to also clarify. So there's the $1 leases on DHL land, but it's also about the commercial and military leases. That's what the question is about. Why can't we charge the military more? But I also think you responded. Can you respond
Yes.
again?
Well, certainly, you know, a lot of those leases are coming up and they're subject to negotiation. So, you know, the state of Hawaii is working through that process. As I think everyone is aware, there's been a number of public hearings about the leases and lease extensions. You know, that will occur probably in the next 5 years or so. The leases, I forget exactly when they're up. I think like 27, 28, 30. I think, but various leases are coming due, and the state is currently negotiating with the federal government about extension of those leases and what would be due as part of the lease rent.
So that is certainly going to be a topic, and it is a part of the fiscal budget piece. I want to point up to a comment that was left in the chat by Annette Tashiro. Is more just a comment, and she doesn't want to come on. I'll just read it. And basically, she said, we need to better collaborate between state agencies rather than working in silos. There seems to be greed and territoriality rather than sharing resources and leveraging federal funds. So I think this speaks to the question and the comment that, you know, government needs to collaborate more, not work in silos, and really try to like work together, which Governor Ige has been a huge proponent of. I have next up, I believe it was Donald Sakamoto, and then I know I saw Representative Cochran from Lahaina. So we have people from all over the state represented. But Donald, are you still there? Can you turn on your camera and ask your question, or would you like me to ask your question? There we go. Go ahead, Donald. You need to unmute. There you go.
Thank you, Representative. Governor Ige, thank you for coming on board and speaking up for the budget as your expertise. My concern as a disabled person and a kapuna now, 62 years old, a young one. I'm worried about transportation for the elderly, kapuna, and the disabled on Neighbor Island, especially Big Island, where we have only limited transportation on Kona and Hilo, but not in between. So I've been trying to work with the legislature for some years now to have coordinators to help the counties to make sure that they ensure that they have good public transportation and affordable and fair transportation for all. But that's my kulian. Thank you.
Thank you. I do know that the Department of Transportation, as part of their transportation plans in each of the counties, work with the counties to develop the mass transit options, as well as find ways that the state can support transportation options in each of the counties. So certainly I think there's always a challenge about resources, but there should be a state county kind of working group looking at prioritizing transportation needs in each of the counties, state and county working together.
I'll do my best this coming years, Governor and Representatives.
Thank you, Donald. I know you are such a strong advocate, so you really have to elevate those priorities, and we appreciate it, and we'll be looking for all of your great testimony. I know that Representative Cochran, are you still with us, Representative Cochran? Go ahead and turn on your video and ask your question.
Yes. Hi, nice to see you. Just flew in from your island. I'm here now in Lahaina. And aloha, Governor Ige. It's so nice to see you and hear all your words of wisdom for us. So as you know, the horrible tragedy that has occurred here in Lahaina, what would, if you've been tracking at all, there's so much to ask, but I just want to know what you would do now to address our situation we're in. And I know it has a lot to do with county, and you talked about collaborating, and it's totally about collaboration for sure. It's lacking at this time. So as a governor, how would you be able to connect these things with the federal level to state, county, collectively working together? Because it's very unfortunate that every day I have families leaving our island, well, Lahaina in particular, right? And a lot of money's on the table. A lot of money has already been spent. And I hate to think that we've spent it down and we're not going to get any more, and this is what we're going to be stuck with. And is it state going to be having to hold the bag and pick up the ball? And that's a really scary prospect as our budget cuts and everything. Anyhow, I think the basic question is, what would you do as governor right now for Lahaina?
I would just say, emergency management and disaster response has always been county driven and state supported, state and federal supported. So, we would convene regularly with the mayor's office and the county councils. As you know, zoning and land use is really a county driven activity. and really talking about working with the county officials about what priorities they have. And I think really focusing on the things that federal agencies can support and the things that won't be supported by federal agencies. And then really developing a prioritized list of things that would help in the recovery, that the state can help support, and helping the county to provide what the community needs. I think that is really important. And I've always felt that state, county, federal collaboration is so important to maximizing the benefits for the community. And, we would meet very often to make sure that those plans can move forward. If there are areas of disagreement, that we could identify what they might be and find solutions. And I think most importantly, kind of work federal, state, county to resolve any issues and ensure that resources can get delivered and projects and programs can be implemented as quickly as possible.
Yeah, well, those words are music to my ear, and I wish it was occurring, is all I can say at this time. So appreciate your time, Governor. I'm looking forward to our next sessions with you. Take care. Mahalo. Aloha.
On that note, I want to say that we have some wonderful comments. We have a very active chat. Maheshi has put some wonderful comments about affordability, hempcrete. We have Nikos weighing in on fiscal notes. We have resources being shared. So what we're going to do is for everyone who's registered, we will send all of this, some of this great information to you from our panelists. But I'd like to kind of start to wrap this up because we know it's dinner hour. And so we want to leave it for our panelists to maybe close this up. We're going to start first with Beth, followed with, I think I said, Governor. You're going to be after Beth, and then Amy, and then myself will wrap up. So go ahead, Beth. What would you like to share as a closing remark?
Well, thank you. It's just been such a pleasure and an honor to be part of this. I think that it is so heartening to see such a good attendance here for this session. And it really bodes well for people being involved in what's going to be good for the future of Hawaii. So thank you for allowing me to be part of that.
Thank you, Beth. Governor, your last words.
Well, thanks to Beth and Della and you and Amy for organizing this. I know that it takes a lot of work to organize it. I do believe and agree with Beth that the budget is the most important product of any legislature. And I do think that transparency is so important so that our community can see what is requested, and I think most importantly, what ultimately gets funded. And I think they deserve an answer about why, what things got funded and what things didn't. So I just thank you guys for organizing this and for inviting me to be part of it.
To my colleague, Representative Peruso, your last remarks.
I just wanted to thank both Beth and Governor Ige for joining us. And, we had immediately following session, we had what we called a Budget 101 in partnership with Appleseed. And we are going to follow this forum up with part 2 on October 17th at 3 p.m. That will be on Zoom, and then we'll have 2 additional in-person meetings. So one will be in Honolulu and one will be in Central Oahu. I'm sorry about the Oahu-centric nature of those community meetings, but we are trying to develop out these conversations. So that's why I'm so grateful for you folks laying the groundwork and really helping us understand the complexity of the process. So often we get caught up in trying to identify a silver bullet. And I think that it's becoming more and more clear that we really have to dig into the details and nuances and do our homework around the budget. So thank you for enabling us to better do our homework.
And I get to wrap it up. I want to thank all of our participants. I think over 70 of you hung in there with us past the 6:30 mark. We have, I think, over 160 or 70. There were registrations still coming in. We want to continue this conversation. I will add my thanks to our panelists. The budget is a difficult thing to understand. It's not just the budget bill, it's the budget bill plus other revenue bills as well as other bills. We have the process that we have to think about and how we can engage the public. And this part, this idea, this 4-part forum that we've created with myself, Representatives Peruso and Representative Capella, who I need to give a shout out to. Representative Capella couldn't join us because she was not feeling well. Hopefully she'll be able to come forward with us later, but we really conceived of this because we want to craft a people's budget. And as the governor said, you know, it's really going to be the governor, Governor Josh Green, who's going to have to put forward his budget. Some of the things that we learned from former Governor David Ige, that it's really going to be important for us to, one, have the financial plan, which we hope the governor will be getting soon since the Council of Revenues have released their last projections. And we also should be looking at the budget instructions to see what are the departments being told that they need to do as they put forward their budget proposals. This is all to say that we're going to be asking for those things of Governor Ige and his administration, and they've been very transparent. So we're hoping that we can get some of that information so that as we craft, what are some of the things that we want to see in a people's budget? Representatives Peruso and myself and Capella, if she can join us, are going to be taking this out for one more Zoom meeting. Again, please put this in your notes. It's going to be October 17th, a Thursday at 3 o'clock. So not quite a Sunday afternoon dinner time Zoom, but Thursday, October 17th, 3 o'clock p.m. will be our next Zoom. And then we're going to do 2 in-person meetings. We have our wonderful, can I just throw a shout out to John Wong and his team? We have the wonderful Olelo Community Media who have been broadcasting this. And so this will also be saved for future viewers. We want to invite everyone as soon as we nail down those dates for Urban Honolulu and Central Oahu, we will let you know. Our intent is to have it happen before the November elections. We want to try to get this in place so that we can then start to submit those priorities to the governor, who the governor creates his budget in December. And that's the process there. And so we really want to get a jump start, get a people's budget crafted. And we so appreciate everyone who has been here to join us. I think that those are my final comments. Thanks again to all of our wonderful panelists, Beth Giesting, Governor David Ige. Thank you to my partner in crime, Representative Amy Peruso and Representative Janae Capella. And we will see you next time on October 17th at 3 o'clock p.m. We hope you join us and bring a friend. Mahalo and thank you.